欢迎收看《实事求是》，带您掌握全球进行式。我是史哲维。今天的节目呢，我们非常高兴为您请到美国著名的政治、政策还有国际问题的分析家，同时呢，曾经担任过副总统钱尼、副国家安全顾问的叶望辉，就奥巴马政府的外交政策、美国与中国大陆的关系，还有美国与台湾的关系，带给我们他的第一手观察还有点评。How are you, Steve? Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Eric. It's wonderful to be with you.
Excellent. Can you give us an introduction to the key foreign policy players in the second Obama administration, and who are they, and what we need to know about them?
Certainly. Well, I guess you'd start at the top. One of the players that didn't change is President Obama, and the other player who didn't change is Vice President Biden. But
Yes.
other than that, there's been fairly large-scale change quickly in the transition to the second term.
Tell us about it.
New National Security Advisor Susan Rice is not new to the world because of the infamous statements she made with regard to the Libya situation a year ago on the anniversary of 9/11. Susan Rice had been our ambassador at the United Nations, was a personal friend of the president's, was with his presidential campaign from the very, very beginning, was known for her experience in Africa and the Rwanda tragedy, is said to be in favor of intervention for humanitarian purposes. The other new player on the team is the woman who replaced her at the United Nations, Samantha Power.
Yes.
Samantha Power was famous for a couple of things. One was political, when she referred to former Secretary of State Clinton as a monster during the primary campaign.
Yes.
But is also famous for support for this foreign policy doctrine of duty to protect,
Yes.
which is related to intervention for humanitarian purposes. Rwanda was another place where she and Susan Rice both had some strong reactions. The two other most important changes I would point to
Yes.
are Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Both are well known to international audiences. Secretary Kerry had spent a very, very long time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In some ways, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before he was a senator, because his claim to fame was testifying before that committee coming
Yes.
back from Vietnam. He's very proud of that long association, and he has ties with leaders around the world that he believes and the president believes will be an asset for him. Senator Hagel was a Republican in the United States Senate, but after leaving the Senate, some of us that are partisan Republicans would say even before he left the Senate, he tended to side with Democrats and centrists on a number of issues. So he's a moderate in the D.C. political sense, but on his job as Secretary of Defense is to manage the decline of the defense budget, because we are in a state of fiscal urgency, if not fiscal emergency. One of the large budget areas that must be cut is in defense. And so he, as a Republican, in some ways, is brought in to deal with the Congress, which is divided over the very sensitive issues of the defense budget. And so we have a very substantial changeover. In past transitions, it hasn't always been a clean house like this. You might have had a Secretary of Defense stay a little longer while a new Secretary of State came in, or vice versa. But in this case, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, complete change.
Do you think that they will be forming an effective foreign policy team? Of course, we know, just like you said, that the Susan Rice, he's a very close friend to President Obama.
Right.
And Mr. Kerry has long had his association with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Chuck Hagel, he put a lot of his emphasis on international issues.
Right.
But compared to their predecessors, do you think there will be just effectives, or there will be some difference in terms of personal styles?
There probably will be some differences on personal style. I would assume there's going to be some difference in the chemistry of how the cabinet interacts. The first-term cabinet was unusual in that Secretary Gates stayed over from a Republican administration into the first few years of the Democrat administration. Hillary Clinton was unusual because she had a very sizable showing in the presidential election and then moved right into a government agency, a former First Lady, a former senator, former almost presidential contender, moving into Secretary of State, very different. But during that period, Secretary Clinton traveled almost all the time, which meant a lot of these decision-making meetings were taking place with her deputy and the others in the Situation Room. So a lot of decisions were made by the White House, and so one of the things that I think is important to remember, even though it's obvious to when we look at it, the president didn't change. It's his policy. By the time you get into the second term, he probably feels more confident. He knows what he thinks he needs to know. He's basically made the core judgments about the direction he wants to go, say with relations to China, the issues emerging in the Middle East, the broad priorities for them. Those decisions should basically be made, and so second term should be about implementation. John Kerry is a senator. Senators are famous for being independent and not necessarily being team players, not in a bad way, but just they do their own thing in the institution of the Senate. It will be very difficult, I would think, for a prominent former presidential nominee to really basically agree to the discipline that you need inside of a cabinet and inside a national security decision-making process. And we see some of the tensions in that coming out in Syria, which we'll talk about, I assume.
Sure. And can you tell us a bit about the key foreign policy priorities for the second term of the Obama administration?
Well, you may remember at the beginning of the first term there were big global issues like climate change and nuclear reduction talks and dialogue with the broader Middle East. That was, I could agree or disagree with the agenda, but it was clear enough to explain. Voters did give it a mandate to give it a try. Second term was very different because the re-election campaign wasn't focused very clearly on what the international agenda should be. And so we had gone through a NATO-led intervention in Libya already, and there was a national controversy about some of the elements of that, that invasion and leadership change in Libya. And so basically the major message out of the midterm election was caution about any more interventions. And what you see is the president having emphasized heavily that the mission in Iraq was completed as he promised. The mission in Afghanistan is winding down and finishing, and the troops will be withdrawn on schedule for his plans, and I think he's been very, very hesitant to intervene elsewhere. I think there's two reasons for that. The country is weary of the commitment of sending troops for a long time, and we're in fiscal crisis, and it obviously costs a great deal. But maybe more importantly, I think the president, just ideologically in terms of his upbringing, his own view of the world, wants the United States to be more of a passive player among the community of nations. And that sounds reasonable to a lot of people, but it's not really the image of America that most Americans have grown up with and come to expect, where we were taught basically to see ourselves as leaders and shapers of the world. And so you have a little bit of this clash of visions about whether America should be first among nations, exceptional, trying to shape events, or, as we said with the Libya intervention, lead from behind. Let others take care of the work, and we support where we can. President Obama's priority in the second term seems to be moving more in that support from behind role, which explains passive approach to Syria to now, and now we have the question of where that goes.
Exactly. Let's go into Syria. One thing that strikes most people the most is Mr. Obama's decision to basically defer the decision-making from executive power to the Congress.
Right.
And does it strike you as odd? Because normally a president would love to increase his executive power and not limiting and voluntarily. And can you tell us about that?
It was an unusual move, and it was an unexpected move, according to many, many people who were tracking this very closely in Washington. The Obama administration itself had been active proponents of a strong executive. They used to call the Bush presidency an imperial presidency, and there were some that were referring to the Obama White House as being an imperial presidency. So it was unexpected in that regard. It was also a very unusual move based on just looking at national security decision-making and presidential leadership. We in the United States, and I think much of the world, has become accustomed to seeing presidents make tough decisions, give their reasons, make their case, and invite people to support. In this instance, President Obama didn't give very many specifics about what his decision was and turned it over to Congress and delayed for a substantial period of time what action we may take. If we end up launching missiles against Syria, Assad and his allies will have had at least 2 weeks to prepare, possibly adjust, possibly plan for how they would like to counter-strike targets to retaliate. So just operationally it was very, very odd, politically very, very odd, and I think the outcome in the Congress is very uncertain. There's no guarantee that the full Senate will vote in favor of this resolution, although since it's controlled by the Democrats, it should. There is definitely no guarantee it will pass in the House, not just because of political opposition. The leaders elected in the House of Representatives are closer to the people in some ways, and polls in the United States are very, very opposed to intervention. If the president would explain why, not only why is this necessary, but how do we plan to deal with what comes next, people might be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and support his plan. But no one believes you can have a limited strike on chemical weapons locations in the middle of a civil war and that there won't be retaliation, there won't be escalation. And the concern is unplanned long-term commitment. That sounds like Iraq and not well received.
好的，休息一下呢，我们马上回来。欢迎回到我们的节目现场。接下来呢，我要继续请教叶望辉先生有关于美国和叙利亚之间的问题。Steve, by going into Congress and asking for a vote, and both in the House as well as in the Senate, do you think it is hurting U.S. prestige and U.S. credibility in the world?
I think, unfortunately, it is perceived as a sign of weakness. The president, when he announced the move, tried as best as he could to describe it as the strength of the country, that the country would be better off, that the world would understand and appreciate him having taken this step. But if you imagine yourself being one of the freedom fighters, if they are such, in Syria, that have been struggling for 2 years, and have lost family, have seen devastation, more than 1 million refugees just going to Jordan alone. This just seemed like weakness. And from a political point of view, it was seen as a desire for the president either to get out of the trap he fell into about setting a red line, it being crossed, and either having to strike where he didn't want to, or not respond and look very, very weak. Or he was looking to share blame. If things were to go badly, he'd wanted to make sure that he could say, well, it was Republicans and Democrats in the Congress that were supportive. It wasn't just my idea.
Yes.
And there's some elements of that that are legitimate, but it only really makes sense if he had been preparing for many months, if he had been making clear what his vision was for the region, how this was important to fulfill his vision for the region, and how this limited operation was believable, could plausibly work, and then to be able to say what the next steps were beyond it, then he would have had a much stronger case to make about he's got a vision, he's showing determination, and now he's going to rally support. Unfortunately, it came within days of him having pressed the UK Prime Minister to prematurely press for a vote in the UK Parliament that was rejected. So it came across as somewhat desperate politics rather than part of some kind of a strategy to rally Americans and then rally a coalition. I think that's just all very unfortunate. I'm sure that's not what he intended, but it inexcusably is the way it came out. And I think that allies in the region are nervous and unsure of what we will end up doing. And we've given a lot of advance warning for our enemies to adjust and plan. So it just really is a significantly large mess up.
Why do you think Mr. Obama did what he did?
Well, I strongly believe that he did not want to intervene in Syria. The civil war has gone on for more than 2.5 years. When you look at the broader turmoil in the Middle East, there was the intervention in Libya that was done under NATO. I think the president was reluctant on that too, was finally convinced by his team to proceed. And then, of course, there were some negative secondary consequences to that move. But you look at the turmoil in Egypt, Iraq, after we have withdrawn, has had heavy Iranian interference. Their al-Qaeda presence had actually grown. And a lot of what's been feeding into the civil war in Syria is actually coming from Iran through Iraq that is being destabilized and further destabilizing Syria. So these trends have not been new. And the death in Syria also is not new. More than 100,000 fatalities, well over 1 million refugees, not even beginning to talk of people who've lost their property or have been injured. And so the devastation has been significant. To focus now on chemical weapons only, and as terrible as that is, on even just fewer than 2,000 fatalities. It's a large number. No one wants to see that, but it's still very difficult to understand why now. And then even if you believe why now, on the one hand, Secretary Kerry is suggesting it's a humanitarian intervention or that we need to change the direction of the civil war. President Obama has been going at great pains to suggest, no, we are not going to target Assad. We are not pursuing regime change. We are not intervening in the civil war. We are just penalizing Syria for using chemical weapons. So it's just a very confusing, mixed message. So it's a sign of weakness and confusion.
And do you think it is in the United States' interest to intervene? Because from what I've heard, you've just said that at least you cast some doubt in terms of what will the United States actually get out of the, I'm sorry to use the word, the mess in Syria.
That's right. Well, I think that we have some very serious national interests at stake in the conflict in Syria. But that's because I see Syria as the latest host of a regional conflict. The Sunni-Shia sectarian struggle is happening there, but also there's a struggle for mastery in the broader Middle East with a rising Iran seeking to add nuclear weapons and expand its influence in the region, with a Saudi Arabia that could one day suffer from its own Arab Spring-like challenges, Egypt in turmoil, an old civilization that has great strategic weight, and Turkey that is seeking to exercise influence in shaping developments in the broader region. And then there's al-Qaeda on top of that, seeking opportunity wherever they can in destabilizing regimes hostile to them or bolstering the political Islamist forces when they come to power. And so I think we have a stake in that outcome. But it requires a broad strategy, not just a country-specific one. And it requires a lot of resources that are not just cruise missiles. It will require intelligence, it will require allies, it will require humanitarian assistance, it will require a comprehensive strategy. And so my view is we either need to step up or step back. Either you take on the big challenge, which I might have some sympathy for, or I am concerned that half measures and limited things might actually make the situation worse, embolden the bad side, and the poor people who want nothing to do with Islamist rule or ongoing violence continue to suffer.
Do you think it's the best interest of the United States to let the situation in Syria us is, because there's a thinking that, of course, Syria is considered not a friend of the United States, to say the least, and so does the backer Iran, and now the Fire Brigade Mujahideen.
Right.
And now you have the three. They are not the friend of the United States engaging in Syria. Right. And at the same time, you have opposition forces who are either extremist Islamists or Al-Qaeda affiliates. And there's been a suggestion that, well, maybe unfortunate as it is, that the best situation for the United States that fits the U.S. interest the most is to let the situation be that way continuously.
That's right. And that is actually a very strongly held view in Washington, in both of the political parties. And they're, you know, in the United States now we have a vibrant conservative movement, a liberal side, and also a libertarian movement that is represented, I guess, prominently by Senator Rand Paul, but also Senator Cruz and a few others. And under the libertarian view, we should just leave these people to sort of kill themselves in a way, or settle their issues. It's not our fight. And they have a sizable audience in America right now. And I can't fully subscribe to that view, mostly because I think that there are consequences to allowing the forces involved in this conflict to just go on forever. I don't think that the Middle East has become safer over the last 2 years, as the Obama administration has essentially left it to local forces to sort out. Egypt is not a more stable and healthy democracy or economy after the United States has largely left forces to sort things out themselves. If we could contain all that's bad in Syria, then it's plausible, I think, to say we'll contain it, and you guys inside the containment zone hash it out. We're very sorry about the human travesty that's going on there, but we can't save everybody everywhere. There actually could be majority support for it. The question is it possible to contain? We weren't able to contain the spillover from the war in Iraq. We weren't able to contain the spillover from the war in Afghanistan. And I don't think that the forces that Iran is sending to participate in this war, and I don't think the forces Hezbollah is sending to participate in this war, intend to stay contained. Their outside intervention is already taking place, and when they're finished in Syria, they will turn elsewhere and take their conflict. And so I think we have the choice: are we going to meet them in Syria and deal with that, or are we going to wait and have to deal with them after they have had more operational practice, potentially more success, and maybe more help from a nation like Russia before they move to the next conflict? I think it's a very scary and unhappy view of where this seems to be headed, but I think it's realistic to imagine that this won't stay contained just because we would rather not have to deal with it.
好的，休息一下之后呢，我们要讨论的是美国跟中国大陆的关系。实事求是，带您掌握全球进行式。你好，我是史哲维。刚刚呢，我们已经请教了这个美国前副总统钱尼的副国家安全顾问叶望辉先生呢，有关于美国的外交政策，还有尤其是美国跟叙利亚现在这个政策的选项。那接下来呢，我们接下来要请教的是呢，美国跟中国大陆的关系。Steve, can you tell us about the current state of US-China relations?
Well, I think the Obama administration had hoped to set up a new structure of expanded strategic cooperation with China. They had some, what they saw as global issues that they wanted to address with climate change and health and a few other areas to reorient away from a decade of war. And they had hoped that they would have strategic cooperation in containing the threat that was coming from North Korea. And they were strongly supportive of the positive trend as they saw it in the cross-strait relationship, and wanted to see, now that some of the anxieties that had been dealt with in the recent decade were past, might we be able to do more in cooperation with China? I don't think that even they would say that their expectations had been met in terms of the bilateral relationship with China. President Obama did visit, and of course, President Obama did host Xi Jinping in Washington to have a little bit of a get-to-know-you visit before he became president of China. So they followed past administrations' patterns of trying to cultivate a relationship with top leaders. But when you look at U.S. and China relations, as much as specialists and people who've worked in this field like to talk about it, it doesn't really come down to personal relationships. The top leaders of China are operating a massive corporation that has lots of complications. The President of the United States is operating the largest corporation on the planet.
Yes.
And the personal rapport is a tiny, tiny factor. And I just don't think that the national interests of China aligned with some of the early priorities the Obama administration had. So they were disappointed at Copenhagen. When it came to looking at sanctions towards Iran, China's national interest didn't seem to align with a new offer to have strategic cooperation. On North Korea, the Obama administration hasn't put forward any kind of a new initiative to try to resolve the nuclear programs. In fact, there have been continued nuclear tests and missile tests and some fatalities in South Korea in the conflict, but there hasn't really been any new activism, no successor to the six-party talks, and the six-party talks themselves have been very sleepy. So when it came to the priorities for dealing with China, it has fallen back to those few issues that are very important domestically. First and foremost, I think that has to do with national security and the economy. There is a lot of talk in Congress, there's a lot of talk in media, and there's a lot of talk with executive officials about how are we going to deal with this kind of a challenge. It came up when Xi Jinping visited the United States and they had their famous California summit.
Yes.
But we had little information about where that will go. The other area that they have focused on is just pure economics. There's a broad perception in the United States. These are not new issues, but they're among the top categories of issues that get discussed at presidential and cabinet level engagements with China. This strategic and economic dialogue deals with this. And the Congress is very, very interested in it. I spent a full year on a presidential campaign following the candidate around, listening to audiences. The American public has some very significant concerns on both of these fronts about what direction China is going and what consequences there could be for the United States. I would think that it would actually be good for China and our leaders if the Chinese government found a way to better explain why some of these problems arise, what is going to be done to try to address them, and try to add some substance to why the U.S. concerns are to be respected, but also can be managed. So I think there's some real challenges there, but it's mostly in this cyber and economic difficulty area.
And putting cyber and economic activities aside, people on this side of the Pacific still perceive that especially the pivot toward Asia declaration is some sort of U.S. grand strategy of trying to check China's rise. But is it how people back in the United States perceive this speech or the action taken hence?
Well, I, of course, have invested half of my life in Asian affairs, and I'm happy whenever there's added focus on Asia. But I think there are two major problems with the administration talking about a pivot or rebalancing to Asia. First and foremost, the problem is that it's not real. It was based on an assumption that the Bush administration had neglected Asia, wasn't in Asia, and so Secretary Clinton repeated early in her tenure that the United States was back in Asia. Well, it hadn't really left, and we are back in Asia basically doing some of the things that we have always done. And so we unfortunately raised expectations in a way where our friends are likely to be disappointed, and at the same time, we've probably provoked a competitor or two being concerned that we might do more than we really will, they will respond and we are not. The whole idea was if we wound down wars in the Middle East, we would have assets and attention to be able to reorient toward Asia. And there's consensus in the United States that our future is going to be tied in important ways to the direction Asia takes in the coming decades. And so there's support for that. But if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, President Obama is going to be no less preoccupied with the Middle East than President Bush was. We don't get to choose the direction the world is going. We have to respond in some ways, and so a responsible leader is going to have to continue to commit resources and time and effort there. When it comes to Asia, we would like to support allies. We would like to engage in a new strategic relationship with China. But I think there have been a lot of meetings, but not really new initiatives, and there aren't results to build confidence in the direction those new initiatives might move in. And so I think that among Asia specialists, there's a lot of talk about the pivot. But when it comes to national leadership, national media, and our public, we have a midterm election coming up in 2014, and I would wager to say that 0 candidates will be highlighting the administration's Asia policy as a reason for voting for their side in the election. So unfortunately, there's just less there than meets the eye. That's very disappointing to me because as I would politically like to oppose the Obama administration, but I would like to support any administration's deeper engagement with Asia.
And it is inevitable for a rising power like China sees the United States, the predominant power, as a competitor and trying to meet the challenges. And there is a lot of talk within China that everything that the United States does or say is all about containing the rise of China. Is it a fair statement? Is there a need to contain the rise of China?
Well, it's an important question, and I think it's important, not least of which because I think a huge number of Chinese people believe this. On the one hand, I can dismiss the notion of the U.S. trying to contain China because if we have been trying to do that, we've done such a terrible job of containing China that we have invested trillions of U.S. dollars in a country we're trying to contain. And we're having military-to-military exchanges with a country we're trying to contain. And we're inviting hundreds of thousands of students to come from China to the United States to have cultural, educational, and professional experiences with a country we're trying to contain. So if we're trying to contain them, we're doing a terrible job. But I think the other way that's important to think about this, most Americans don't think of China as a country that is good or bad. They might think of what they see the government doing as something that they support or oppose, but they don't necessarily attribute those feelings towards Chinese people. And so for Americans, there can be this separation of respect for a long cultural civilization, and so it's a little bit complicated that way. But last of all, I think it's important for people in China to understand, while they wake up every day thinking about China and what is facing China, even those of us in America who have great respect for what China represents don't wake up every day thinking about China. I've done work in the media for recent years. In the last year, I think that I have been asked to do only one interview on China in doing foreign policy segments. And I'm the only one who actually visits China and can speak Chinese. And so there's not the same level of focus and attention on China as there is growing up in China and thinking about what the United States and the world is doing. We all have a certain sense of the rest of the world looking at us. We're the center of it. But in this case, we're not. And so really, in the United States, the people who are hawks are disappointed that we're not paying enough attention to China and the threats they perceive. And the doves are frustrated that we're not paying enough attention to China and the opportunities that could be had. And then it's odd in that context to hear from China concern that we're paying too much attention to them to the degree it's actually presenting a threat. Something is not connecting in this equation.
And if there's one thing that the government and the people of the People's Republic of China need to learn about the United States, what would that be?
Well, I think that it's important to basically be transparent, honest. I think Americans are perfectly willing to accept the idea that China might have different national interests or different near-term goals. No bilateral relationship is full of agreement. But don't try to downplay, push aside, or otherwise hide some important realities that our two countries need to face. It is very important that when it comes to China's economic health and welfare, that we have accurate and transparent information about what's going on in China's economy. We're heavily vested in it. Upswings and downturns in China both can have a major impact on our interests and things that are happening in our own country. And when it comes to speaking about pride in your country, it's a very delicate line that we all have to be careful of. Everyone respects having respect for your family, your culture, your homeland. But if you cross that line and it becomes nationalism that hurt China's image and provoke a response that they say they don't want. So I hope that they can understand how to find ways to demonstrate pride in their accomplishments, pride in their civilization.
And you have much respect for that.
Absolutely. I think a lot of Americans going back centuries have had a little bit of a romance with what we see in China, that whether it comes from the arts, language, music, trade, a lot of respect. And so we need to find a way for those good things to be communicated more clearly, but still be honest about the areas where we're going to have competition and concern.
休息一下，接下来呢，我们要讨论的是美国跟台湾之间的关系。欢迎回到我们的节目现场。在这一段呢，我们要讨论的是美国跟台湾的关系。首先，我要请教的呢，就是呢，我要问 Steve， 台湾在美国的这个政策上，它的定位到底有多高 ？Hi Steve, a question. People here in Taiwan always perceive the relationship between the United States, the People's Republic, and Taiwan as one of trilateral relationship. But from the Chinese perspective, of course, it is the bilateral relationship. It is under the bilateral relationship umbrella. It's the US-China relations, and then we have a Taiwan problem. And how does the people back in Washington, back in the United States, perceive as the nature or the framework of the relationship?
Well, Americans in traditional form complicate this because you're correct, the Chinese have a very clear sense of where they see the framework and that Taiwan is a subordinate issue in the US-China relationship. There are some Americans who frankly see it the same way. But there are also elements of the U.S. government, say in the U.S. Congress, who see U.S.-Taiwan relations as a bilateral issue and U.S.-China relations as a bilateral issue. And they don't really approach it as being part of a whole policy in which China and Taiwan are apart, and they don't see it necessarily as Taiwan being a part of China issues. We have very little sense of mission in the world right now with regard to China. When we had the Cold War, it was very clear to say Taiwan fits in American foreign policy strategy with regard to China as part of the broad Cold War narrative and the interests that were at stake there. We've had 9/11 and a war on terrorism. Neither China nor Taiwan were central to that dialogue, and we haven't really informed what we aim to accomplish with both of the relationships. So I think at this point, American official policy is that Taiwan is not a subordinate issue in the U.S.-China relationship, but it's included among those issues discussed in U.S.-China relations. Certainly every presidential summit There is some reference to the very familiar words about a one China policy in 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. But there isn't a lot of detail about what exactly we aim to do with Taiwan and how it fits with what we're trying to accomplish with China. So we are of multiple minds. In some ways, it's 2 separate bilateral relationships. In some ways, it's a subordinate relationship. In others, it's sort of an inconvenience that must be addressed when we want to have just a bilateral relationship with China. I think it's unfortunate because there are many parts of the world where 23 million people would be worthy of the attention of the president on its own from time to time. And that doesn't happen that often with Taiwan.
Are you sort of satisfied with the current state of affairs between the United States and Taipei?
Well, I'm concerned in the following way. With the election of President Ma and the warming trend in cross-strait relations, a lot of people are very relieved that tensions have lowered. They believed it would allow for basically a broader and more substantive conversation with the mainland about what we're trying to do there instead of having to spend so much time talking about Taiwan and cross-strait issues. But unfortunately, I think what it's led to is a sense that there's no problem anymore. Peace has come at a price, and the price is irrelevance. We don't have to think about this part of the world anymore. It used to be we were worried that miscalculation could lead to war, but the perception is that's not going to happen, no. And so essentially we move on to other issues. I don't think that's a fair assessment of how things have gone. I think there has been a warming trend in cross-strait relations. That's fine. But there are still fundamental differences, and there are still fundamental risks. And we still have an investment in substantive relations with both sides of the strait, and that requires attention. And I just don't perceive there to have been enough attention to the cross-strait relationship since the sigh of relief that tension has eased. And that's just an unfortunate consequence.
And speaking of arms sales issues, of course, the Chinese side will put emphasis on the August 18th communique, and which is basically in direct contradiction to the so-called 6 assurances issued by President Reagan, and not to mention that there's a Taiwan Relations Act. And according to recent demonstrations, the United States claims that our One China policy is based on the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. And tell us, where does 6 assurances fit in, number 1? And number 2, 3 communiques and the TRAs, Taiwan Relations Act, is there a difference in terms of statutes, or which one overrides the other, or they can coexist peacefully?
Yeah, it definitely gets complicated. Too many players in this game in terms of the kind of relationships that are shaping what our policy is. It would be far better if we didn't have to rely on basically 30, soon to be 40-year-old agreements and statements. Communiques are just statements. They're not law, they're not treaty, and they're not necessarily binding any more than you can have another communique, and whatever the newest communique is will just be, by custom, overtaking in priority the content of previous communiques. In US-China relations, it's been treated differently, almost as if these were religious tablets that were written in stone and can't be changed and will be policy forever. It's not the way policy is made in any other area, and it probably isn't sustainable that way. Under our system, law is of higher import and power than any statement, even a statement by a president, a statement repeated by subsequent presidents. But law, whether it's treaty or domestic law, is supposed to take priority. The 6 assurances, I think, were very, very important for that time. They're very important in terms of the substance addressed even to current issues now. The great disadvantage that the 6 assurances have in terms of their standing is that people can read what the three communiques say. People can read what the Taiwan Relations Act says. For the 6 assurances, we are relying upon reports of what was said at a time in history. It's not an actual document that was drafted for and signed by a president and put into a public archive. There were officials that were relevant at the time, like former Ambassador Jim Lilly, that made public what the contents were, but were basically going on his account. I believe him. I think it was accurate, but it has a fundamentally different standing to say my account of a private statement is going to compete with law passed by Congress, signed by a president, and communiques that were signed publicly and available for all to see. I think it would be far preferable if a U.S. president would articulate a clear policy to Americans in English that made sense to them. When I say speak English, one of the problems with the way our leaders talk about China will be sensitive to Chinese viewers, but one China, just the words, doesn't make any sense to ordinary Americans. They immediately wonder, how many did you think there were? Or what? They didn't realize there was an issue with how many Chinas there are. And it doesn't deal with the substance of what our relationship needs to be. So Americans need something that's more descriptive in terms that they would understand. What problems are we meant to address? What are the means we would deploy to try to address them? And why should we believe this is going to work? It's relatively simple. One China, 3 communiques, TRA doesn't necessarily tell them that. And so it's a little bit disappointing.
And do you think there is a way of creating a win-win-win situation for the United States, Beijing and Taipei?
Yes, but under limited circumstances. It probably will rely upon alignment of interests which can fluctuate over time. It could be that there'll be a moment in China's experience on the mainland where priority is placed on something other than territorial claims. It could come at a time when U.S. and Taiwan and China share an interest in a particular strategic matter and are able to make sort of a new breakthrough. But fundamentally, you have a cross-strait relationship where there is a struggle for identity and control. And it's very hard to see how you can have shared identity and shared control without there being complications.
今天呢，我们非常感谢这个前美国副总统钱尼的副国家安全顾问叶望辉先生到我们的节目上来，就这个奥巴马的外交政策、美国跟叙利亚的这个议题，还有呢美中关系以及美台关系，做他深入的、精辟的见解。实事求是，带您掌握全球进行式。我是史哲维，我们再会。